Hey folks, today's devoted to everyone who got their
asparagus
murdered in OG Ninja Gaiden. I say this because I'm going to be taking a dive into Studio Sabotage's retro-styled action platformer, The Messenger. Join me as I battle through its 8-bit, 16-bit, as I rampage through this retro romp. But did I come away feeling this messenger should have been shot, or was this order truly special? I'm your host, Darlian, and let's find out together. In a world pushed to the brink by demons, a small pocket of humanity persists, refining their martial arts for the day when the legendary warrior of the West will save them. You are not him. Instead, you take the role of the messenger, tasked with carrying a mystical scroll to the highest mountain in the land in order to fulfill an ancient prophecy. It's a brief summary, I know, but I'm trying not to delve too deeply into spoiled territory, which can be pretty hard at times given the way certain twists and turns unfurl over the course of the game. Things become a most excellent adventure. What I can say is that for the folks craving a solid story, there's definitely something to be found, as the narrative is nowhere near as simple as it seems, with the messenger taking some serious strides in building up an interesting world to explore. Speaking of which, I found myself incredibly fond of the characters and overall writing in this game. There's some genuinely clever dialogue to be found, some overall enjoyable gags, and some exemplary bits of meta humor that wound up resonating with me. Suffice to say, I wound up motivated to seek out every bit of optional dialogue I could with the shopkeeper, something which wound up intensely rewarding not only due to her snark, but because it resulted in some pretty interesting stories and philosophical rambles. Honestly, my only narrative gripe is the simple fact that the DLC leaves things off on a hell of a cliffhanger. I'm really hoping more will come to resolve the narrative threads they've cultivated, though given there's an ARG for the Messenger and its expanded universe, I suppose I could meander into Sabotage's Discord to try and seek some semblance of answers. Still, that's starting to get a bit off topic, so let's get back on track and start chattering mechanics, given this title brings some neat elements to the table. To kick things off, The Messenger is a stellar example of a platformer providing players what I found to be an easy-to-learn experience, albeit with a lot of depth to its systems. Yes, the basics can be summed up as jumping and slashing through a slew of stages, but it's really not long until a player will find themselves accruing skills which can broaden the ways in which they can make their way around the world. Whether it's the nuance of the cloud step, an extra jump triggered by landing a mid-air strike, to the speedy activation of a mid-air grappling hook, or the leisurely glides of the wingsuit, you're gradually introduced to an increasing number of movement mechanics, the likes of which you'll wind up using in all sorts of complex combinations during both the main game's platforming segments, as well as its more difficult optional puzzles. Frankly, some of these segments were frazzlingly fiendish and made me extremely grateful the game had omitted lives in favor of checkpoints. Even if it meant I was saddled with a sassy demon who rewarded my every ignoble demise with incendiary insults and made meals of my moolah. Which, right, there's currency. Specifically time shards, which can be spent to unlock a number of talents. Now, whilst these are all optional, I found them immensely useful, not only because they provided me a lot more survivability, they also further fleshed out my kit. Seriously, the Shuriken talent wound up being an instrumental item in my battles against bosses, given the complexity of those encounters, including some pretty harrowing platform experiences in the midst of them. It felt nice to be able to bypass bullshit and bring on the beatdown. Still, as much as the game allowed me the opportunity to think outside the box, I'll admit I wound up occasionally frustrated when I left an area due to having obtained an item or ability that would have allowed me to access a secret after I lost the ability to backtrack and take advantage of it. That said, as I progressed further, it wound up making a lot more sense, and that's because I was fibbing a little bit when I only called the game a platformer. Around the midway mark in The Messenger, you're sent on a trip through time that would make even a turtle envious. I mean, okay, not really, the trailer spoiled this, but yes, time travel, and a pretty active sort too, given the game will send you bouncing between both past and future variants of the game's areas, effectively turning it into a Metroidvania. I found it immensely rewarding to explore these regions as thoroughly as possible, not only to soak in the differences between the time periods, but to take a peek at the plethora of tantalizing side areas which had once taunted me. There's something immensely satisfying about ambling about these areas to shore up all the secrets I've been obliged to pass over, or just to fire through them with a full arsenal of movement abilities. something which was only further facilitated by the introduction of a map. Thank God. But also due to the introduction of a fast travel system. Given there's a few lengthy side quests that'll see you venturing through the various stages, it's an extremely welcome addition. That said, there's also post-game content to tackle, and it's pretty interesting. For one thing, there's the free Picnic Panic DLC, which offers up players a whole new set of stages to platform across. While less open-ended than the main game, there's still plenty of challenging content to go over, and new enemy and bosses to encounter. Said bosses may have involved 2 instances where I was mulched into fertilizer for the better part of a half hour. An excruciating experience, which also translated over to the DLC's collectible hunting, given some of its optional platforming segments were daunting as hell. Frankly, it made me wish there was more to the weird racing segment that kicks off Picnic Panic, since that was at least an altogether relaxed bit of collectible hunting and associated boss battle. But anyways, if you do dive into the DLC, I would recommend playing through the entirety of it, since backing out will put you at a stage select, and whilst that is a neat feature, it also means you'll be subjected to certain cutscenes over again. That said, there's also an additional bit of post-completion content to tackle, and that's the New Game Plus mode. And there's definitely some neat things here, given that not only does it let you start with all your talents and upgrades, it lets you choose one of the progression items you need to move through the game, essentially allowing you to bypass or tackle things differently than you would have in your vanilla run. Still, things aren't just smooth sailing, given that the overall difficulty of the game does creep up, introducing some harrowing modifiers like increased damage and boss health, as well as a form of permadeath. That's right, in New Game Plus, if you don't have enough time shards for your avaricious demon companion, you'll be sent back to the beginning. And I don't just mean of that run, I mean you will be sent back to New Game Plus 1. And that's if you don't just do what I did and make a deal with the Voodoo Spirit for incredible power at the cost of having a single life period bar whatever time shards you have. Ha 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 ha. Okay, that was a lot. So, let's move on. So, there's a lot I appreciate about The Messenger in a stylistic sense. It's a delightful example of gorgeous looking graphics in 8-bit, but the ante is then upped when you realize that there's an equally eye-catching 16-bit version of the enemies and areas to boot. Thank you, time travel, thank you. Speaking of which, swapping between those two eras also has a secondary side effect, given it changes up the OST depending on if you're in the past or present. Or maybe it's the present and the future? Fuck. Look, there's a lit soundtrack, that's the main takeaway, though I'll also admit there's a detail I didn't go over. Whenever you're underwater, it does grow more muffled. It's a neat attention to detail, that sort of feeling of being submerged in the sound effects. Anyways, conclusion time. I think at this point it should be fairly apparent that I dug The Messenger. I'm actually immensely grateful that I managed to dive into this game with very little in the way of spoilers, as it meant I got to be fully immersed in all its weird humor, fun story, and the gameplay itself. It was a blast. The overall process of exploring the world was a ton of fun, and I felt a real sense of mastery when I managed to finish off a particularly difficult platforming sequence, or one of the bosses. These guys were genuinely tricky encounters that wound up giving me a real sense of achievement when I figured out their nuances. Also, special mention to the Picnic Panic final boss. I don't want to spoil it, but it's hilariously great and a wonderful finale to things as it stands. But yeah, between all that, some gorgeous sprite work, and a genuinely baller soundtrack, I can say I appreciated what The Messenger had to offer, enough so that even though it wasn't able to coax me into the masochism that was its New Game Plus mode, I'd still say that's more than warrants being called a crit hit. Anywho, thanks for tuning in. If you agree, disagree, or just have something to say to me, feel free to comment. If you have an interest in supporting my efforts to create new indie reviews, interviews, and gaming content, hit the subscribe button and the bell so you know there's a new release. There's also a Discord, links in the description, so you can be part of our community, the Crit Hit Cauldron. That said, I'll catch you on the next episode of Crit Hit. Take care till then, folks. But yes, really, if you have any thoughts on what we're doing currently with the channel and the videos, really let us know in the comments. We're trying to work things out here for the best experience possible. I'm gone for real now.